The wind that tore through the high basin of the Colorado Territory in the late 1870s did not just blow, it scoured. It carried the grit of 10,000 miles of empty plain and the biting ice of the peaks that loomed like white-toothed saws against the gray slate of the sky. Here, winter did not arrive with a polite knock. It slammed the door shut, sealing the valley between the timberline and the struggling settlement of Blackwood in a tomb of silence and cold. Blackwood was a town that clung to the earth as if afraid the wind might finally succeed in peeling it away. It was a collection of raw lumber and mud, centered around a dust-choked main street that turned to a glue-like slurry when the snows melted. There were 3 saloons, each smelling of stale beer and unwashed bodies, a general mercantile with exorbitant prices, and a small, whitewashed church that looked startled to be there at all. Scattered around the perimeter were the homesteads, sod-roofed and hunkered low, where families fought a daily war against the elements and the isolation. To the west of this grim civilization, the land rose sharply into the timbered hills, a place of deep shadows, towering pines, and silence that felt heavy enough to crush a man. It was into this borderland between the town and the wild that Elias Ward rode, a solitary figure on a horse that looked as weary as its rider. Elias was a man whittled down to the bone by years of hard riding and harder living. He wore a canvas duster that had once been tan, but was now the color of road dirt, stiff with grease and dried rain. Beneath the brim of his hat, his eyes were the gray of a storm cloud, watchful and tired. He had been a scout for the Union Army once, a man who could read the turn of a leaf or the scratch on a rock like a printed page. Now, he was just another drifter, a hired gun for railroad surveyors who paid little and cared less. He shifted in his saddle, a hiss of breath escaping through his teeth as pain flared white-hot in his side. A week ago, a dispute over a property line and a surveyor's stake had turned violent. Elias had taken a bullet meant for a man who had not even thanked him. The surveyor had patched him up with a needle and thread meant for canvas tents and sent him on his way with $50 and a canteen of bad whiskey. The wound was burning now, a deep, throbbing heat that radiated out from his ribs and settled in his marrow. Elias knew the signs, the angry red streaks, the swelling, the heat that felt like a coal pressed against his skin. Infection was setting in, moving with the slow, inevitable creep of a shadow at sundown. He nudged his horse, a roan gelding named Banjo, up the narrow, treacherous trail that wound toward the higher elevations. He needed water, and he needed a fire that would not be seen by the prying eyes of the town below or the outlaws who drifted through the passes. As the horse picked its way over loose shale, Elias's mind drifted, unmoored by the rising fever. The wind sounding in the pines shifted, sounding like the roar of artillery. He blinked, and for a second, the gray rocks of the pass became the gray uniforms of dead boys scattered across a field in Virginia. He remembered the smoke. It had tasted of sulfur and copper. He remembered the noise, a wall of sound that made thinking impossible. And he remembered the silence that came after, which was worse. He saw the face of a lieutenant, a boy no older than 19, holding his own intestines in his hands and crying for his mother. He remembered the map spread out on camp tables, officers arguing over terrain they had never seen, moving regiments like chess pieces while Elias stood in the corner, knowing that the ravine they were pointing to was a death trap. He had told them. They had not listened. He shook his head, trying to clear the cobwebs. That was a lifetime ago. He was 35 years old, but he felt 100. He had walked away from the surrender at Appomattox with a bitter heart, feeling used, discarded like a spent casing. The country he had fought for had moved on, eager for expansion and gold, while men like him were left to wander the empty spaces, carrying the ghosts of the things they had done and the things they had failed to prevent. The trail widened, opening into a small, secluded meadow sheltered by a sheer granite cliff. A stream cut through the center of it, the water running black and fast, rimmed with ice. It was a good place, defensible, hidden. Elias slid from the saddle, his knees buckling as his boots hit the frozen ground. He grabbed the stirrup leather to keep from falling, waiting for the world to stop spinning. Easy now, he told himself. Just make camp. Just get warm. He stripped the gear from Banjo, his movements slow and clumsy. The saddle felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He hobbled the horse where the withered grass was thickest, then turned his attention to himself. He needed to clean the wound. He needed to wash the blood and the trail grit from his clothes before the infection killed him. It was a madness to strip down in this cold, but the fever was making him irrational, convinced that the filth on his skin was the enemy. He gathered wood, deadfall from the pines, and coaxed a small fire into life against the base of the cliff. The flames licked up, orange and hungry, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone with trembling fingers. Elias unbuttoned his shirt. The fabric stuck to his side, glued by dried blood and pus. He peeled it away with a grimace, tossing it toward the water. He unbuckled his gun belt, letting the heavy Colt Navy revolver thump onto his bedroll. Then the trousers, the boots, the long underwear that was gray with dust. He stood naked in the biting wind, his body a map of his history. There was the puckered scar on his shoulder from a saber slash at Bull Run, the burn mark on his thigh from a black powder accident, and now, the angry, inflamed gash on his ribs, oozing and angry. He stepped into the edge of the stream. The water was so cold it burned, shocking the air from his lungs. He gritted his teeth, taking a handful of the icy water and scrubbing at his side. He washed the clothes as best he could, wringing them out with shaking hands and draping them over the rocks near the fire to dry. He stumbled back to the fire, shivering violently. The cold was seeping into his bones, warring with the heat of the infection. He wrapped himself in his single thin wool blanket and lay down on the hard earth. Curling toward the flames, he just needed to sleep, just for an hour. Then he would dress, make a poultice from pine pitch, and ride on. But sleep, when it came, was not a rest. It was a falling. The fever rose up like a tide, drowning his senses. The sky above him, beginning to bruise with the colors of twilight, began to spin. The stars that pricked through the clouds trailed light like falling embers. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonely, yipping sound that echoed off the canyon walls. To Elias's delirium, it sounded like a rebel yell. "Hold the line," he muttered, his voice a dry rasp. He thrashed beneath the blanket, kicking it away. The heat of his body was unbearable now. He felt like he was burning up from the inside out. He was back in the medical tent, smelling the gangrene and the chloroform. He was back in the mud, trying to stem the bleeding of a friend who was already gone. "I am sorry," he whispered to the empty air. "I tried to tell them. I tried. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the dark." Elias did not flinch. He lay sprawled on the dirt, naked and defenseless, his breathing ragged and shallow. The weapon he had lived by was 5 feet away. Useless. The horse was grazing with its back to him. He was alone in the vast, indifferent cathedral of the Rockies, and the cold was beginning to creep in past the fever, seeking the core of him. High above the meadow, on a ridge where the wind stripped the snow from the rock, Willa Kane paused. She was a creature of this land, shaped by it as surely as the twisted juniper trees that clung to the cliffs. She was 24 years old, but her face held the wariness of someone much older. Her skin was brown from the sun and wind, taut over high cheekbones. Her hair was a dark, tangled mane, tied back roughly with a strip of leather to keep it out of her eyes. She wore no skirts or petticoats. Willa wore the clothes of a man, trousers of heavy wool that were tucked into worn, high-topped boots, and a buckskin coat that had been patched and repatched so many times it was more map than garment. A repeating rifle, a Winchester she kept oiled and spotless, rested easily in the crook of her arm. A heavy skinning knife hung at her hip. The town of Blackwood had many names for her, and she knew them all. They drifted up to her on the wind, spoken in hushed tones by trappers she passed on the trail, or shouted by drunkards when she ventured too close to the settlement. Feral, witch, whore, savage. They said her family had been wiped out in an Indian raid 10 years ago. They said she had been taken, that she had lived among the tribes and lost her soul to heathen ways. They said she chose to live like an animal, eating raw meat and worshipping strange gods. The truth was simpler and far more brutal, but Willa kept it locked behind her teeth. She had survived. That was her crime. She had survived when she was supposed to die, and she had refused to come down to the town and beg for scraps of pity from the very people who had turned a blind eye to her family's murder. She was checking her trap lines, moving with a silent, fluid grace that left no disturbed earth, no snapped twigs. She had learned to walk this way from the Ute band that had found her, starving and half frozen, years ago. They had not pitied her. They had taught her. They had taught her that the land was not an enemy to be fought, but a parent that was both generous and cruel. She smelled the smoke before she saw it. It was distinct from the scent of pine or damp earth, the smell of burning wood. Sharp and sudden, Willa stopped, her senses narrowing to a fine point. A fire meant people. People meant danger. She crept forward, keeping to the shadows of the tree line, placing her feet with deliberate care. She peered down into the meadow, her eyes scanning the darkness. A single horse, hobbled, a small fire, dying down to coals, and a shape on the ground. She frowned. It was not a camp of outlaws. They would have a lookout, or at least be loud in their confidence. It was not a hunting party. There was only one horse. She moved closer, descending the slope like a ghost. Her hand rested on the hilt of her knife. When she reached the edge of the firelight, she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. A man lay there, stark, naked. Willa blinked, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks in the gloom. He was sprawled on his back, his limbs cast out as if he had been dropped from a great height. His clothes were draped over the rocks, stiff with ice. She stepped into the circle of light, her rifle raised, ready for a trap. But the man did not move. She looked down at him. He was lean, built of corded muscle and bone. His skin was pale in the moonlight, slick with sweat despite the freezing air. But it was the scars that held her gaze. They crisscrossed his body like a chaotic map, puckered bullet holes, long, pale lines of knife or saber cuts. He looked like a man who had been put together and taken apart a dozen times. Her eyes traveled to his side. The bandage had come loose, revealing a jagged, angry wound that oozed blood and yellow fluid. The skin around it was fiery red. He's a fool, she thought, the word sharp in her mind. A damn fool to strip down and sleep in the open like this. She watched his chest rise and fall in hitching. Shallow gasps. He muttered something, his head thrashing side to side. Forward, he rasped. Don't stop. Willa took a step back. She should leave him. That was the rule that had kept her alive for a decade. Never trust a stranger. Never let anyone close. The last time white men had come to her family's home, they had brought fire and death. She looked at his face, beneath the beard and the grime. He looked young, or perhaps just broken. There was no cruelty in his features, only a slack, terrible exhaustion. He was going to die. If the cold didn't take him tonight, the infection would take him by tomorrow. The coyotes were already singing his eulogy. Willa turned away, looking back toward the dark safety of the trees. It would be easy. Just walk away. Let the winter have him. It took what it wanted anyway. But then her eyes landed on his canteen. It was stamped with the letters U.S., an army canteen, and the way his scars told a story of violence endured, not inflicted. He was wounded. He was hunted. Maybe. Just like she had been. She looked at the vast emptiness of the valley around them. There was no one coming for him. No one knew he was here. He was completely, devastatingly alone. Something twisted in Willa's chest. A pang of recognition. She knew what it was to be discarded. She knew what it was to be looked at as something other than human, or to not be looked at all. Damn it, she whispered, the sound harsh in the silence. She couldn't do it. She couldn't leave him to freeze. She moved quickly then, decision hardening her movements. She knelt beside him, touching his forehead. He was burning up, his skin radiating a terrifying heat. Wake up, she said. giving his shoulder a rough shake. Elias groaned, his eyes fluttering but not focusing. He struck out blindly with one hand, mumbling about flank movements. Willa caught his wrist, her grip iron strong. "Hush now," she ordered. "You are not fighting a war tonight." She grabbed the fur blanket from her own pack, a heavy buffalo hide robe that was her most prized possession. She threw it over him, tucking the edges under his shivering body. She went to his horse, quieting the animal with a low murmur and a stroke of its nose. She saddled it quickly, her hands efficient and sure. She gathered his stiff, frozen clothes and shoved them into his saddlebags. She picked up his gun belt, checking the loads from habit, and hung it over the saddle horn. Then came the hard part. She walked back to Elias. "I am going to hurt you," she said matter-of-factly. "And you are going to be heavy, so don't you fight me." She grabbed his arm and hauled him into a sitting position. Elias cried out, a raw sound of agony as his side stretched, but he was too weak to resist. Willa gritted her teeth, crouching low, and pulled his arm over her shoulder. "Up," she commanded. She drove her legs upward, using every ounce of strength she possessed. She was not a large woman, but she was made of wire and determination. She hauled him to his feet, his dead weight nearly crushing her. He stumbled, his legs useless, and she caught him, wrapping her arm around his waist. "Move your feet, cowboy," she grunted, staggering toward her own pack horse. It was a brutal, ugly struggle. Twice they almost fell. Elias was dead weight, his head lolling against her neck, his sweat soaking into her buckskin coat. Willa cursed him, cursed the snow, cursed the soft heart she hadn't known she still had. She managed to get him to her horse. She couldn't lift him into the saddle, he was too heavy for that. Instead, she draped him over the animal's withers like a sack of grain, lashing his legs to the cinch strap so he wouldn't slide off. It wasn't dignified, but it would get him there. She took the reins of both horses and began the climb. The trail to her cabin was a deer track, invisible to anyone who didn't know the mountain. It wound up through the timber, steep and treacherous. Willa walked at the head, her breath pluming in the air, her boots slipping on the icy rocks. She didn't look back at him. She just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, driving herself with a stubborn, angry rhythm. She had risked her solitude. She had brought a wolf into her den. If he woke up and tried to hurt her, she would have to kill him, and that would be a waste of all this effort. It took an hour to reach the cabin. It sat in a fold of the hills, sheltered by a hanging cliff face and a stand of ancient pines. It was built of rough logs and river stone, low and sturdy, designed to withstand the crushing weight of the snows. Willa halted the horses and untied Elias. He slid down into her arms, completely limp now. She dragged him through the door, kicking it shut behind her against the wind. The inside of the cabin was dark and smelled of sage and wood smoke. She hauled him to the narrow bed in the corner, a frame of pine poles strung with raw hide and piled with furs. She rolled him onto it, gasping for breath, wiping sweat from her eyes. She lit the kerosene lantern that hung from the rafter. The golden light flooded the small space, revealing the rough-hewn table, the cast-iron stove, the drying herbs hanging in bundles from the ceiling. Willa didn't rest. She stoked the fire in the stove until it roared. She filled a pot with water and set it to boil. She turned back to the stranger. He was shivering violently again, his teeth chattering with a sound like dry bones rattling together. She stripped the buffalo robe off him, then peeled away the damp blanket he had been wrapped in. He lay there, stark and pale against the dark furs of her bed. Willa looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the way his ribs pressed against his skin, the hunger that mirrored the hollows in her own face. She saw the scar on his shoulder that looked like a star. She went to work. She washed the wound with hot water and soap, scrubbing away the dirt and the pus. He flinched in his sleep, a low moan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. She took a jar of salve she had made, bear grease mixed with pine pitch and yarrow, and slathered it over the angry red skin. She tore strips from a clean cotton shirt, one of the few she owned, and bound his ribs tight. He was thrashing again, his hands grasping at the air, fighting invisible enemies. "No," Willa said. "None of that." She found lengths of soft rawhide, efficiently, without hesitation. She tied his wrists to the sturdy pine frame of the bed, not tight enough to cut the blood flow, but secure enough to keep him from tearing his stitches or hurting himself. She stepped back, wiping her hands on a rag. The cabin was warm now. The wind howled outside, scratching at the logs, but it could not get in. Elias lay still, bound and bandaged, his breathing deepening as the warmth and the exhaustion took him. His face, relaxed now in sleep, lost some of its haunted look. Willa stood over him, her arms crossed over her chest. She felt a strange, terrifying weight settle in her gut. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was responsibility. She had spent 10 years making sure she needed no one, and no one needed her. She was a ghost. She was a myth. She was the wild girl who ran with the wolves. And now, there was a man in her bed. She reached out, almost involuntarily, and brushed a lock of damp, dark hair away from his forehead. His skin was still hot, but the frantic edge of the fever seemed to have dulled. "You gave me no choice," she whispered to him, though he could not hear. "You lay down in the snow to die. I couldn't let the mountain have you." She looked around the small, single room that was her entire world. It felt different now, smaller, denser. She looked back at him. "I brought you here," she said softly, her voice fierce and low in the quiet room. "That makes you mine to keep alive." She touched the handle of the knife at her belt. "A nervous habit. You are claimed stranger," she said. She said it not like a captor, but like someone drawing a line in the dirt, like she was defying the town, the cattle baron who had killed her family, and the god who had turned his back on them. She was claiming him from death. She was claiming him from the cold. She pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down, her rifle across her knees. She would not sleep tonight. She would watch him. She would listen to his breath and the wind. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest, erasing their tracks, sealing the cabin away from the world. Inside, the fire crackled, casting long shadows that danced over the sleeping man and the wild girl who watched him with eyes that were ancient and afraid and fiercely, terrifyingly alive. The light that woke Elias Ward was gray and thin, the color of dirty dishwater, filtering through the chinking of logs he did not recognize. It was not the open sky, and it was not a canvas tent. It was a ceiling of rough-hewn timber, low and heavy with shadow. He drifted up from the bottom of a deep, dark well. His body felt distant, a heavy thing that did not quite belong to him, aching with a dull, thumping rhythm. He tried to move, instinct firing before thought, his muscles tensing to roll and reach for the Colt Navy that should have been under his head. He could not move. His wrists were held fast, not by iron cuffs, but by something yielding yet firm, binding him to the wooden frame of the bed. Panic, cold and sharp, sliced through the fog of his fever. He jerked hard, his breath catching in his throat as a white-hot line of pain seared through his left side. He gasped, arching his back, fighting against the restraints with the desperate, blind energy of a trapped animal. He was a prisoner. The war had come back for him, or the surveyors had sold him out, or he had been taken by the very outlaws he had been trying to avoid. "Stop it," a voice said. It was not a man's voice. It was low, scratchy, and calm, cutting through the sound of his own ragged breathing. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He turned his head, his neck stiff and sore. A woman stood at the foot of the bed. She was a blur at first, a silhouette against the gray light of the single small window. As his vision cleared, she sharpened into focus. She was dressed in buckskins and men's trousers, her hair a wild tangle of dark brown pulled back from a face that was all angles and sun-weathered skin. She held a Winchester rifle in the crook of her arm, casual but ready, and a skinning knife with a staghorn handle rested at her belt. "If you keep thrashing like a landed trout, you are going to tear those stitches open," she said, "and I am not going to sew you up again. I have wasted enough thread on you already." Elias stared at her, his mind reeling. He looked down at himself. He was covered in a heavy pile of furs. Bear, he thought, and buffalo. But beneath them, he could feel the cool air against his skin. He was naked. "Where are my clothes?" he croaked. His voice was a wreck, like he had swallowed a handful of gravel. "Where is my gun?" The woman nodded toward the stone hearth on the far wall, where a fire snapped and hissed in a cast-iron stove. His duster, shirt, and trousers hung from a line of rawhide, steaming slightly in the warmth. His gun belt was coiled on a wooden peg, the heavy revolver still in the holster, far out of his reach. The rifle, his Henry repeater, leaned against the wall near the door. "Your clothes are drying," she said. "I washed the blood out of them. As for the gun, it is where I put it. You are in no shape to use it, and I do not care to be shot in my own home." Elias tested the bindings on his wrists again. They were strips of soft cloth, maybe muslin, tied with a knot he recognized. A cavalry hitch. "Untie me," he said, trying to summon a tone of command that had been lost somewhere in the fever. "I will," the woman said. "Not moving? When you promised to stay put, I tied you because you were fighting devils in your sleep. Mister, you were trying to tear your own side open. I did not haul you up this mountain just to watch you bleed out on my bed tick." Elias fell back against the pillow, the fight draining out of him as the pain in his side pulsed. He remembered the stream, the ice water, the feeling of the world tilting on its axis. He looked at the woman again. She was small, wiry, but she stood with the grounded solidity of an old oak tree. "You brought me here?" he asked. "I found you by the creek," she said, "naked as the day you were born and half dead from fever. You looked like you were trying to freeze yourself into a statue. I put you on my horse and brought you up." "Why?" Elias asked. The question seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suspicious. In the West, charity was a rare commodity, and usually came with a price tag attached. The woman's expression hardened. She shifted the rifle, her eyes narrowing. "Because I am a fool." "Likely," she said flatly. "Now, are you going to behave? Or do I leave you tied up while I go check my traps?" "I will behave," Elias said. He knew when he was beaten. Willa leaned her rifle against the wall and approached the bed. She moved with a silent economy of motion, stepping like a hunter. She drew the knife from her belt. Elias flinched, his muscles locking up, but she ignored him. She sliced through the cloth strips with a quick, practiced motion, freeing his right hand, then his left. She sheathed the knife and stepped back quickly, putting distance between them. "Do not try to stand up too fast," she warned. "You have lost blood." Elias rubbed his wrists. The skin was red but unbroken. He pulled the furs up to his chin, suddenly acutely aware of his nakedness and the way she was looking at him. It was not a look of desire, nor was it shy. It was the look a rancher gave a sick calf, evaluating, clinical, and detached. "Who are you?" he asked. "Willa Kane," she said. Elias paused. He knew the name, or rather, he knew the whispers. The wild girl, the one the townspeople crossed themselves when they mentioned. "They say you are dead," Elias said. "Or gone to live with the tribes." Willa let out a short, sharp sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "They say a lot of things in Blackwood," she said. "Most of it is horse manure. And who are you? Stranger, who goes sleeping in the snow with a hole in his ribs?" "Elias Ward," he said. He waited for a reaction, but she gave none. The war was 10 years gone, and his name meant nothing here. "I was guiding surveyors for the railroad," Elias continued, his voice strengthening slightly. "We ran into trouble near the basin, a dispute with some men working for a cattle outfit." "Which outfit?" Willa asked sharply. "The Lazy P," Elias said. He saw a shadow pass over her face, a tightening of the jaw that was there and gone in a heartbeat. "You made enemies of them?" she asked. "I did not care for their methods," Elias said, "and I do not care for men who shoot from cover. I took a bullet meant for the surveyor. I rode out before they could finish the job." Willa watched him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face for the lie. When she found none, her shoulders relaxed. "Just a fraction. You are safe enough here," she said. "No one comes up this high. not the lazy pea, and not the law. She turned to the stove. Lifting a heavy coffee pot, she poured a tin cup full of black, steaming liquid and brought it to him, setting it on a stool beside the bed. "Drink," she ordered, "then sleep. I have work to do." She grabbed her coat from a peg and went to the door. Before she opened it, she turned back, her hand on the latch. "If you are thinking of stealing my horse or my guns, Elias Ward, remember that I know this mountain and you do not. You would make it about 100 yards before I dropped you." "I believe you," Elias said. Willa nodded once, then slipped out into the cold, the door thumping shut behind her. The storm hit 3 days later. It began as a darkening of the northern sky, a bruise of purple and black that swallowed the peaks. By noon, the wind was screaming like a banshee, tearing at the shingles of the cabin roof and driving snow through the cracks in the logs. Inside, the world had shrunk to a 12 by 12 room. Elias was sitting up now, dressed in his own trousers and shirt. Though he moved with the stiffness of an old man, the fever had broken, leaving him weak and hollowed out, but clear-headed. He watched Willa as she moved about the cabin. She was a marvel of efficiency. She wasted no movement. Every step had a purpose, stoking the fire, cleaning a trap, kneading dough for biscuits on the scarred table. He felt useless. It was a sensation he detested. He had been a soldier, a scout, a man who earned his keep. Sitting here, wrapped in a blanket, while a woman half his size hauled firewood, gnawed at his pride. "Let me do that," Elias said, standing up as Willa reached for the empty water bucket. She turned on him, her eyes flashing. "Sit down," she said. "I can fetch water," Elias argued. "I am not an invalid." "You are exactly an invalid," Willa snapped. "You ripped those stitches, and I have to sew you up again. I am low on whiskey to numb you, and I am not listening to you scream. Sit down." "This is not right," Elias said, grabbing the handle of the bucket. "You are waiting on me like a servant." Willa yanked the bucket back with surprising strength. "I am not your servant," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous low. "And this is not your camp. This is my cabin, my valley, my rules, in this house. You do what I say, or you go sleep in the shed with the horses." Elias held her gaze. He saw the fierce independence in her, the wall she had built brick by brick against a world that wanted to crush her. He let go of the bucket. "All right," he said softly. "Your rules." Willa stared at him for a second longer, as if expecting him to strike her, then turned and marched out into the howling white. When she returned, covered in snow, her eyelashes frosted with ice, Elias was waiting by the stove. He had not taken the bucket, but he had taken the knife and the pile of potatoes she had been preparing. They were peeled and sliced, ready for the pot. He held up the knife, handle first, offering it back to her. "I can peel," he said. "That does not require heavy lifting." Willa looked at the potatoes, then at him. The corner of her mouth quirked up. "Just a little. They are cut too thick," she said, taking the knife, "but they will do." It was a truce. As the storm raged, burying the cabin in drifts that reached the windowsill, a routine emerged. It was a quiet, domestic rhythm born of necessity. Willa hunted when the wind died down, bringing back snowshoe hares or grouse. Elias cleaned the game, his hands regaining their steadiness. They spoke little, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the crackle of the fire, the scrape of a spoon on a tin plate, the whistle of the wind. Elias watched her. He watched the way she checked the door latch 3 times before settling in for the evening. He watched the way she ate, hungry and quick, as if she expected the food to be taken away. He saw the loneliness she wore like a coat, and he recognized it, because he wore the same one. He told her stories, sometimes, to fill the dark hours. He told her about the cities back east, about the oceans he had seen, about the strange, sad humor of soldiers. He did not tell her about the blood. He sensed she had seen enough of that. She listened, her hands busy mending a snare or greasing a boot. She asked questions that were sharp and insightful. She wanted to know how a steam engine worked, how much a pound of coffee cost in St. Louis, why men fought wars for lines on a map. One evening, as the wind rattled the door on its hinges, Elias looked at her across the table. "You have a good mind." "Willa," he said, "you could do well down there." "In the world?" Willa snorted. "Threading a needle. The world down there thinks I'm a witch or a whore," she said without looking up. "Why would I want to be part of it?" "People are foolish," Elias said. "They fear what they do not understand. They fear what they cannot control," Willa corrected him. "And no one controls me." Elias nodded slowly. He admired that about her. He admired the steel in her spine, but he also saw the cost of it. The nights were the hardest. The temperature dropped until the nails in the walls popped with the sound of gunshots. The stove was a valiant little warrior, but it could only do so much against the crushing weight of a mountain winter. The cabin had only one bed for the first 2 nights. Elias had insisted on sleeping on the floor, wrapped in his duster and a spare blanket. He was a gentleman, or he tried to be, and the idea of sharing the narrow tick with this wild, guarded woman felt like a violation of the truce. But on the 3rd night of the storm, the cold was a physical weight. Elias lay on the floorboards, his teeth chattering so hard his jaw ached. The draft from under the door was a knife of ice slicing through his clothes. From the darkness of the bed, Willa's voice spoke. "Get up," she said. Elias shuddered. "I am fine. You are making so much noise shaking that I cannot sleep." She said, "Get in the bed." Elias hesitated. "It is not proper." "Proper?" Willa laughed. A harsh sound in the dark. "Mister, we are miles from the nearest preacher, and if you freeze to death on my floor, I am the one who has to dig a hole for you in frozen ground. I am not doing that digging. Get in the bed." Elias dragged himself up. He was shivering violently. He moved to the bed, sitting on the edge. "Boots off," Willa commanded. He tugged his boots off and slid under the heavy pile of furs. The bed was narrow, painfully narrow. Willa was pressed against the far wall, her back to him. Elias lay on the edge, rigid as a board, terrified of touching her. They lay there in the dark, back to back, separated by inches of cold air. Elias could feel the heat radiating from her, a tantalizing promise of warmth. He kept his hands clenched at his chest. "Good night, Willa," he whispered. "Go to sleep." "Ward," she muttered. Sleep was a long time coming. The air between them was thick, charged with an awareness that was sharper than the cold. Every time she shifted, Elias held his breath. Every time he shivered, he felt her stiffen. But exhaustion eventually won out, sometime in the deep gray hours of the morning. Elias woke to find that the distance had closed. He had rolled backward in his sleep, seeking warmth. His back was pressed against hers. He could feel the curve of her spine against his, the warmth of her flannel shirt. He should have moved away. He knew that, but the warmth was so good, so necessary. He stayed there, breathing in time with her, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling a strange, fragile peace settle over him. It happened again the next night, and the next. The awkwardness began to erode, worn down by the simple, biological imperative of survival. They were 2 warm bodies in a frozen world. One night, his hand drifted in sleep, landing on her hip. He woke with a start, snatching it back. Willa did not move, but her breathing hitched, a small, sharp intake of air. She did not push him away. The boundary was shifting. The line Willa had drawn in the dirt was being covered by snow. Then came the night the mercury bottomed out. The wind had stopped, which was worse, because it left a silence so deep and cold, it felt like the air itself had shattered. The frost was thick on the inside of the window pane. The water in the bucket by the stove had frozen solid. Elias was already in bed, shaking uncontrollably. The cold had settled into his wound, making it ache with a deep, grinding pain. Willa climbed in beside him. She was wearing everything she owned, 2 shirts, wool socks. She lay down, but the furs were not enough. The cold was seeping up through the mattress, down from the ceiling. "Elias," she whispered. It was the first time she had used his first name. He turned his head on the pillow, his teeth clicking together. Yes, we are going to die if we stay like this," she said. Her voice was small, stripped of its usual bravado. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Willa took a breath. She turned over, facing him in the dark. "Come here," she said. Elias hesitated for a heartbeat. Then he moved. He shifted toward her, and she met him halfway. It was awkward at first, a tangle of limbs and hesitation, but then desperation took over. Elias pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her small, wiry frame. Willa buried her face in the hollow of his neck, her hands clutching the back of his shirt. The contact was a shock. It was electric. Elias felt the heat of her against his chest, her thighs against his. He felt the rapid thrum of her heart, beating like a trapped bird against his own ribs. They lay spooned together, wrapped in a single cocoon of survival. Elias curled his body around hers, shielding her from the draft. Willa pressed backward into him, stealing his warmth, giving hers in return. His chin rested on the top of her head. Her hair smelled of wood smoke and pine needles. He had an overwhelming, terrifying urge to press his lips to it, to kiss the crown of her head. He fought it down, clenching his jaw. He would not cross that line. He would not be another man taking what was not offered. Willa lay rigid in his arms for a long time, her breath hot against his neck. She felt big. He felt solid. For 10 years, the only things that had touched her were the wind and the snow and the rough fur of animals. To feel a human hand on her back, a human chest rising and falling against her own. It was almost too much to bear. It terrified her more than the storm. But slowly, the terror melted into something else, a profound relief, a softening. She relaxed against him, her hand trapped between them, uncurled and rested flat over his heart, right over the bandage on his side. He is alive, she thought. I kept him alive, and now he is keeping me warm. They fell asleep like that, tangled together, the boundaries between them dissolved by the frost. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the world scoured clean and brilliant white. The sun was blinding. Elias and Willa sat by the stove, drinking the last of the coffee. The intimacy of the cold nights hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. They moved around each other with a new awareness. When their hands brushed as they passed the coffee pot, neither pulled away immediately. Elias looked at her. The harsh light from the window illuminated the fine lines around her eyes, the stubborn set of her chin. "Why do they say it was a raid?" he asked quietly. Willa froze, her cup halfway to her mouth. She looked at him, her eyes guarding a deep, old wound. "Because it is easier than the truth," she said. "Tell me," Elias said. Willa set the cup down. She looked at her hands, calloused and scarred. "My father had the best water rights in the valley," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He homesteaded it legal, 40 acres of bottom land in the creek." She paused, swallowing hard. Harlan Pike wanted it. He offered to buy it. Pa said no. Pike offered again, for less money. Pa told him to get off his land. She looked up at Elias, her eyes burning. 2 nights later, the riders came. They wore masks, but I saw their boots. I saw their spurs. They were silver, with a rowel shaped like a star. Pike's men wear those spurs. "What happened?" Elias asked softly. "They burned the cabin." Willa said. "They shot Pa in the doorway. Ma hid me in the root cellar, told me to stay quiet no matter what. I heard them. I heard what they did to her before they killed her." Her voice cracked, a fracture in the stone. "Then they set the fire. I waited until the heat was burning my skin. Then I ran. I ran into the dark and I didn't stop. I went up into the timber." "And the town?" Elias asked. Willa laughed bitterly. "The town?" Pike told the sheriff it was a band of renegade Utes. Said he saw the signs. The sheriff drank Pike's whiskey and took Pike's money, so he agreed. They wrote it down in the book. Indian raid. She leaned forward, her hands gripping her knees. "If I go down there and say it was Pike, I am a liar. I am the crazy girl who lived with the savages. Who would believe me over the man who owns half the county?" She turned away, staring into the fire. "So I stay here. I claim the high ground, and I wait." Elias watched her. He felt a cold anger uncoiling in his gut, familiar and deadly. He knew men like Pike. He had seen them get rich on government beef contracts during the war while soldiers ate maggoty hardtack. He had seen them draw lines on maps that erased people's lives. Pike, he said, testing the name on his tongue. It tasted like ash. He reached out and covered her hand with his. It was a bold move. In the daylight, Willa flinched, but she did not pull away. "You are not crazy." "Willa," he said. She looked at him, her eyes wet but fierce. "I know," she whispered, "but knowing it doesn't change anything." "It might," Elias said. "Elias." He squeezed her hand. "We are out of coffee," he said, shifting the subject, though his eyes remained locked on hers. "And the flour is low." Willa took a breath, composing herself. She pulled her hand back, but slowly. "We need to go down," she said. "We have pelts to trade, and you need to move on. You are healed enough to ride." Elias looked at the door, then back at her. "I am not leaving you to face this winter alone," he said. "Or Pike." Willa opened her mouth to argue, to tell him she didn't need a protector, but the words died in her throat. She looked at the empty coffee pot, then at the man who had held her through the freezing night. "We go together then," she said. "But if you get us killed—" "Ward, I will never forgive you. I will keep that in mind," Elias said. He stood up and went to the window, looking down toward the valley where the town of Blackwood lay like a stain on the snow. He felt the phantom pain in his side, and a new pain, sharper and more dangerous, in his chest. He was not just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for the girl with the wild eyes and the broken heart. And that, he knew, was a far more dangerous thing to do. The thaw arrived not with a warm breeze, but with the sound of breaking bones. It was the ice on the creek cracking, a pistol shot sound that echoed through the high valley day and night. The relentless white silence of winter gave way to the dripping of eaves, the slush of wet snow sliding off pine boughs, and the churn of mud. The air still held a knife edge of cold, but the sun lingered longer now, turning the drifts into heavy, gray sludge. Inside the cabin, the walls felt closer than they had during the blizzard. The larder was dangerously light. The flour sack was nothing but a dusted cloth, and the coffee tin held only dregs that Willa had boiled 3 times over until the water tasted like burnt wood. Willa stood by the table, counting the pelts she had cured over the long winter. There were 6 prime beaver skins, thick and glossy, a dozen muskrat, and 2 silver fox pelts that shimmered like trapped moonlight. It was a good haul, enough to buy supplies for the spring and maybe a new axe head. "We have to go down," she said, not looking at the man sitting by the stove. Elias Ward looked up from the boot he was oiling. He had healed. The gaunt hollows of his cheeks had filled in, and the wound in his side was now a puckered pink scar that only pulled when he twisted too hard. He moved with his old grace now, a quiet economy of motion that Willa had found herself watching more often than she cared to admit. "I will saddle Banjo," Elias said. Willa stiffened. "You do not have to go. I have made this run 100 times. Elias set the boot down. He did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to see right through her defenses. "I am eating your food. Willa, I am sleeping under your roof. And I owe you a life. I am not letting you ride down there alone with a pack string to haul back 50 pounds of flour. Besides," he added, standing up and reaching for his hat, "a man goes too long without seeing a town. He starts to forget how to talk to people who aren't stubborn mountain women." Willa let out a sharp breath through her nose. "You are fit to ride. Then—" "Fit enough," Elias said. "And I am going." Willa did not fight him. Part of her wanted to maintain the solitude that was her shield. But another part, a treacherous, quiet part deep in her chest, was relieved. The thought of facing the town alone, as she always did, suddenly felt heavier than the pack saddles. They rode out an hour later. The trail was a treacherous ribbon of mud and slick rock. The horses picked their way carefully, their hooves sucking at the earth with wet, popping sounds. Willa rode in front, her Winchester scabbarded by her knee, her hat pulled low. Elias followed, his eyes scanning the ridgelines and the timber, a habit of war that peace had never broken. As they descended, the air grew thicker, heavier with the scents of the lower valley, wood smoke, wet wool, livestock, and the sulphurous tang of coal. The town of Blackwood sprawled in the mud below them, a grid of raw timber buildings and false fronts that looked like they had been dropped from the sky into the muck. Willa's posture changed the closer they got. Her back straightened until it was rigid, her shoulders hunched slightly, as if she were bracing for a physical blow. She checked the knife at her belt, then the pistol she kept hidden under her coat. Elias watched her. He saw the armor go up. He nudged Banjo forward, bringing his horse alongside hers until their stirrups almost brushed. He did not speak, did not offer hollow reassurances. He simply put his bulk between her and the open road, a silent wall of presence. Willa glanced at him, startled by the proximity, but she did not pull away. They hit the main street at noon. It was a churned river of brown slurry, rutted by wagon wheels. The town was busy. Men in canvas coats shouted at teams of oxen. Women in dark wool dresses hurried along the boardwalks, lifting their hems above the filth. The reaction to Willa was instantaneous. A silence rippled out from where they rode, spreading like a wave. Conversation stopped, heads turned. A woman sweeping her porch froze, then grabbed the arm of her child and yanked him inside, slamming the door. Elias heard the whispers. They hissed from the shadows of the saloon porches and the gaps between buildings. There she is, the wolf girl. Look at her, dressed like a man. Ain't natural. Elias felt a heat rise in his collar that had nothing to do with the sun. He looked at the faces watching them, hard, pinched faces, eager for something to hate. He saw the smirk on a blacksmith's face, the open disgust in the eyes of a passing clerk. Willa did not look left or right. She stared straight ahead, her jaw locked so tight a muscle jumped in her cheek. She rode through the scorn as if she were riding through a fire, determined not to let them see her burn. They pulled up at the hitching rail in front of Gable's General Mercantile. Elias swung down, his boots sinking 2 inches into the mud. He tied Banjo, then moved to help Willa, but she was already on the ground, unlashing the bundle of furs from the pack horse. "I can manage," she muttered, hoisting the heavy bundle onto her shoulder. Elias stepped back, his hand hovering near his gun belt, his eyes sweeping the street. He followed her up the steps and into the store. The interior smelled of pickle brine, sawdust, and dry goods. It was dim and warm. Mr. Gable, a balding man with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual sheen of sweat on his upper lip, was weighing a sack of sugar for a rancher's wife. When Willa walked in, the bell above the door chimed cheerfully. Gable looked up. His smile vanished like a candle blown out in a gale. The rancher's wife turned, saw Willa, and gathered her skirts, moving to the far end of the counter as if Willa were carrying cholera. Willa walked to the counter and dropped the bundle of furs. The thud was loud in the quiet room. "I need flour," she said, her voice flat and hard. "Coffee, salt pork if you have it, and a box of 44 cartridges." Gable did not greet her. He did not ask about her winter. He reached out and untied the bundle, flipping through the pelts with 2 fingers, as if touching them soiled him. "Beaver is down," Gable said, not looking at her. "Market in St. Louis is flooded. Silk is in. Fur is out. These are prime winter coats," Willa said. "Look at the thickness." Gable shrugged. "I can give you $4 for the lot." Willa went still. $4? That is barely enough for the flour. The fox alone is worth 10. Take it or leave it. "Miss Kane," Gable said, turning his back to her to adjust a jar of peppermint sticks. "I am doing you a favor taking them at all. Not many folks want to buy goods that smell of wildness." The insult was plain. The rancher's wife tittered nervously. Willa's hands curled into fists on the countertop. She looked at the pelts, her labor, her survival. The hours spent freezing in the creek water, being dismissed as trash. Elias stepped forward. He moved quietly, his spurs chiming softly on the floorboards. He came to stand beside Willa, towering over the counter. He took off his hat and set it down, then leaned forward, resting his hands on the wood. "Weigh them again," Elias said. Gable turned around, startled. He looked at Elias, the width of his shoulders, the scar that ran into his hairline, the cold, flat gray of his eyes. "I beg your pardon," Gable squeaked. "You heard the lady," Elias said. His voice was low, rolling like distant thunder. "These are prime winter pelts. I have seen the prices in Denver. Beaver is holding steady, and silver fox is rare. You are trying to cheat her because you think she has no one to speak for her." The room went deathly quiet. The rancher's wife stared, mouth agape. I run an honest business," Gable stammered, sweat popping out on his forehead. "Then prove it," Elias said. "Put them on the scale, and give her the market price, or I will take them across the street to the livery and sell them to the stagecoach driver. He knows good fur when he sees it." Gable swallowed hard. He looked at Willa, then at the dangerous stranger standing beside her. He licked his lips. $12, Gable muttered. "For the lot." "15, Elias said. "And you throw in a tin of peaches," Gable grumbled. But he reached for the cash box. 15. Willa stood frozen. She looked at Elias, her expression a mix of shock and a sharp, stinging humiliation. She had fought her own battles since she was 14. To have this man step in, to have the town obey him just because he was a man and carried a gun, made her feel small. Before Gable could count out the coins, the bell above the door chimed again. The air in the store changed instantly. It grew colder, sharper. Harlan Pike walked in. He was a man who owned the space he occupied. He was tall, broad-chested, wearing a charcoal wool coat that cost more than Willa's cabin. His boots were polished to a high shine, untouched by the mud outside. He had a silver-gray mustache, neatly trimmed, and eyes the color of frozen slush. Behind him stood 3 men. One was his foreman, a heavy-set man named Dutch with a broken nose. The other 2 were hired guns, their hands resting casually on the butts of their revolvers. Pike took off his hat, revealing a head of thick, iron-gray hair. He looked around the store, his gaze sweeping over the goods, the trembling shopkeep, and finally landing on Willa. His smile was a terrifying thing. It was polite. It was charming. It was the smile of a wolf looking at a trapped lamb. "Miss Kane," Pike said. His voice was smooth, cultured, a jarring contrast to the rough twang of the town. "We so rarely see you grace us with your presence." Willa turned slowly. Her face had gone pale, drained of blood, but her eyes were blazing. "Pike," she said. "Is the winter treating you well up in the timber?" Pike asked, stepping closer. He smelled of expensive bay rum and cigars. "It must be lonely. A young woman, all by herself in those dark woods." "I manage," Willa said. She reached for the coins Gable had placed on the counter, her hand shaking slightly. Pike's eyes flicked to the pelts. "Still trapping. I see. Scavenging off the land. It is a hard life. Your father wanted better for you, as I recall." "Do not speak of my father," Willa hissed. Pike tutted softly. "A tragedy. Truly. The savagery of this frontier. It takes the best of us and leaves the rest to go wild." He looked around the store, raising his voice so the rancher's wife and the shopkeep could hear. "It is a wonder she is still alive, isn't it?" Pike said, shaking his head. "After that Indian raid took her poor folks, most girls would have died of grief. But Willa, she just ran off and joined the very land that killed them. Some say she has forgotten how to be civilized entirely. It was a performance. He was painting her as a curiosity, a broken thing, a savage. He was reminding the town why they hated her." Willa grabbed her flour sack, her knuckles white. "I am leaving." She tried to step past him. Pike moved, blocking her path. He did not touch her, but he stood close enough that she had to stop or run into him. "What is the rush?" Pike asked softly. "Back off. Pike." The voice cut through the store like a whip crack. Pike turned his head slowly. He looked at Elias, who had moved to stand at Willa's shoulder. Elias's hand was nowhere near his gun, but his stance was coiled, ready to strike. "And who might this be?" Pike asked, looking Elias up and down with amusement. "Another stray you picked up? Miss Kane?" "My name is Ward," Elias said, "and the lady is trying to leave. Step aside." Pike's eyes narrowed slightly. He recognized the look in Elias's eyes. He had seen it in the eyes of men he had sent to die at Shiloh and Antietam. "Ward," Pike said, testing the name. "I heard there was a drifter causing trouble for the surveyors, a man who does not know his place." "My place is wherever I am standing," Elias said. Pike chuckled. "A dry sound. You have sand, Mr. Ward." "I like that. But you should be careful. Men who take up with damaged goods often find themselves in difficult situations." He took a step toward Elias, invading his space. "The hills are dangerous," Pike murmured, his voice dropping so only Elias and Willa could hear. "Accidents happen. Rock slides, fires, stray bullets. It would be a shame if a man of your talents wasted himself protecting a feral girl who is likely to slit his throat in his sleep." Elias did not blink. "Are you threatening me, Colonel?" Pike's smile vanished. "I was a major, actually, and I'm offering you advice. I am always looking for men who can shoot and ride, men with sense. You could earn $50 a month riding for the Lazy P, sleep in a bunkhouse, eat warm meals, instead of rotting up in a shack with a ghost." "I would rather rot," Elias said. The tension in the room snapped tight. Dutch, the foreman, shifted his hand to his pistol. Elias's hand drifted toward his Colt. "Stop it," Willa shouted. She shoved herself between Elias and Pike. She looked up at Elias, her eyes wide and furious. "Do not," she said. "We are leaving now." She grabbed Elias's sleeve and yanked him toward the door. Elias held Pike's gaze for 1 second longer, a promise of violence deferred, before allowing Willa to pull him away. Pike stepped aside, sweeping his hat in a mocking bow. "Do visit again, Miss Kane," he called after them. "The town misses you." Willa burst out of the store and into the mud of the street. She didn't stop at the horses. She marched toward the livery stable, her breath coming in short, angry gasps. Elias caught up to her, grabbing her arm. "Willa, wait!" She spun on him, shoving his chest with both hands. "You fool!" she hissed. "You damn fool! Were you trying to get killed? I was trying to stop him from treating you like a dog," Elias snapped, his own temper flaring. "I did not ask for your help," Willa shouted. People turned to look, but she didn't care. "I have handled Pike for 10 years. I ignore him. I survive him. I do not draw down on him in the middle of the general store. He humiliated you," Elias said. "He stood there and lied about your family and mocked you, and you wanted me to do what? Stand there and watch?" "Yes," Willa cried, her voice breaking. "Yes, because that is how I stay alive. By being invisible, by being the crazy girl who doesn't matter. You stood up and challenged him. And now he sees me. Now he sees you. You made it worse." She turned away, shaking, wrapping her arms around herself. "He is going to come for us now," she whispered. "You poked the bear, Elias, and I am the one who is going to get mauled." Elias stood there, the adrenaline fading into a sick feeling in his gut. He looked at her trembling shoulders. He wanted to touch her, to comfort her, but he knew she would bite his hand off. "Go to the horses," he said quietly. "Load the supplies. I have business at the livery." Willa looked at him, wiping her eyes with the back of a dirty glove. "What business?" "Just go," Elias said. He turned and walked toward the livery stable, his boots heavy in the mud. He needed to cool down. He needed to think. The livery was dark and smelled of wet hay and horse manure. Elias leaned against a stall door, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. He watched the smoke drift up to the rafters. "Got a light, stranger?" Elias turned. An old man was sitting on a bale of hay in the shadows. He was withered as a dried apple, with a white beard stained yellow by tobacco. He was whittling a piece of pine. Elias struck another match and held it out. The old man leaned in, the flame illuminating a face etched with 1,000 lines. "Saw what happened in the store." The old man wheezed, puffing on a pipe. "You got a death wish, son?" "Maybe," Elias said. "Or maybe I just don't like bullies." The old man laughed. "A dry rattle?" Harlan Pike ain't a bully. A bully pushes you in the dirt. Pike buries you under it. The old man spat into the straw. Name's Jeb, he said. I used to ride for the Kane outfit, before the fire. Elias straightened up, tossing his cigarette away. You knew Willa's father? Good man, Jeb said. Honest, that was his mistake. Pike wanted that water. The Kanes controlled the creek head. Pike made offers, threats, then, poof, Indians. Jeb looked at Elias, his rheumy eyes sharp. Ain't no Indians ride at night in a snowstorm, son. And ain't no Ute war party leaves a trail that leads straight back to the Lazy P bunkhouse. Elias stepped closer. You saw the trail? I saw the brand, Jeb whispered. The night before the fire, I was out looking for a stray. Saw 3 riders up near the Kane place. Moon caught the silver on their spurs. Pike's men. Why didn't you speak up? Elias asked, his voice tight. Jeb snorted. And end up like Kane. I got old by keeping my mouth shut. But seeing that girl today, seeing her standing there, looking so much like her mother. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a crumpled, greasy scrap of paper. He pressed it into Elias's hand. Ben Carter, Jeb said. He was one of them riders, a young buck. Not mean, just followed orders. He quit Pike a week after the fire. Took to the bottle. Last I heard, he was mining silver over in Oro City. He knows, if there is anyone left who has a conscience, it is Ben. Elias looked at the name scrawled in pencil. Ben Carter. Watch your back. Ward, Jeb said, going back to his whittling. Pike owns the law here, but he don't own the past. Not yet. Elias shoved the paper into his pocket. Obliged, he said. He walked back out into the light. The street seemed different now. The mud looked like blood. The town looked like a trap. He found Willa by the horses. She had loaded the flour and the coffee. She was mounted, sitting stiff and upright, staring at the mountains. Let us go home, Elias said, swinging onto banjo. They rode out of town without speaking. The silence between them was not the comfortable silence of the cabin. It was a loaded thing, heavy with unsaid words and bruised pride. The ride back was grueling. The sun dipped behind the peaks, and the temperature plummeted, turning the mud back into iron-hard ruts. The wind picked up, biting through their coats. Elias watched Willa's back. He thought about the scrap of paper in his pocket. He thought about Pike's threat. He thought about the fear in Willa's eyes, not for herself, but for the fragile life she had built. He had broken her rules. He had stepped into her war and made it his own. They reached the cabin well after dark. They unloaded the horses in silence, carrying the heavy sacks inside by the light of the moon. Willa lit the lantern, the golden light revealing the familiar, safe walls. But it didn't feel safe anymore. Pike's shadow had followed them up the trail. Willa began to put away the flour, slamming the tin onto the shelf. You should pack your gear, she said, her back to him. Elias stood by the stove, warming his hands. What? You should go, Willa said. Pike offered you a job, or a threat. Either way, you are a target now. If you stay here, he will come for you, and he will burn this place down to get to you. I am not leaving, Elias said calmly. Willa spun around. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears she refused to let fall. Why? She shouted. Why do you care? I am nothing to you. I am just a savage girl who patched you up. You do not owe me your life. You paid your debt when you bought the flour. It is not about debt, Elias said. Then what is it? Willa demanded. She crossed the room, shoving him in the chest. Is it pity? Is that it? You look at me, and you see a poor, broken orphan who needs a big, strong soldier to save her. I do not need your pity. Elias Ward, I have survived bears and blizzards and starvation. I do not need you to feel sorry for me. Elias caught her wrists. He held them tight, stopping her from hitting him again. It is not pity. He roared back, his voice filling the small cabin. He stared down at her, his chest heaving. The anger and the fear and the adrenaline of the day boiled over. You think I pity you? Elias said, his voice shaking. Willa, you are the toughest soul I have ever met. I have seen men, brave men, soldiers, break under half the weight you carry. I have watched you walk through fire and come out steel." He pulled her closer until their faces were inches apart. "I do not stay because I feel sorry for you. I stay because when I am out there, drifting, I am a ghost. But when I am here, with you, I feel real." Willa stared up at him, her breath hitching. The fight drained out of her, replaced by something sharper, hotter. She felt the roughness of his hands on her wrists. She saw the raw honesty in his eyes. "You make me feel real," Elias whispered. The air between them crackled. It would be so easy to close the distance, to lean forward and press her mouth to his, to let the fire that had been building between them for weeks finally consume them. Willa's gaze dropped to his lips, then back to his eyes. She trembled, terrified, not of Pike, not of the town, but of this, of wanting him, of needing him. She pulled her hands free. She stepped back, putting the table between them. "Elias," she breathed. She turned away, gripping the edge of the table. We should sleep," she said, her voice unsteady. Elias stood there, his hands still raised as if holding onto a ghost. He slowly lowered them. "Yeah," he said roughly. "We should." He walked to the window, staring out at the dark, hostile wilderness. He fingered the piece of paper in his pocket. "Willa," he said, his back to her. "There is something else." Willa looked up. "What?" "I met a man in town. He told me about the night of the fire." Willa went still. "He said he saw riders." Elias continued. "With Pike's brand, and he gave me a name. Ben Carter. A man who was there. A man who might talk." Willa made a sound, a small, wounded noise in her throat. "If we find him," Elias said, turning to face her, "we can prove it was Pike. We can make him pay." Willa looked at him, her eyes wide. Justice. It was a word she had stopped believing in. But looking at Elias, standing there solid and unyielding, she felt a flicker of something she thought had died in the ashes of her childhood home. "Hope. Ben Carter," she whispered. "We find him," Elias said, "and we end this." Willa nodded slowly. She looked at the bed they shared, then at the man who was willing to ride into hell for her. "We end this," she agreed. The wind howled outside, rattling the door. But inside, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a plan, and a promise, and a heart-stopping, terrifying love that neither of them dared to name, but both were ready to die for. The silence that filled the cabin in the days following their trip to town was heavy, but it was not empty. It was the heavy, charged air that comes before a summer storm, thick with unsaid words and the memory of the confrontation in the general store. The threat Harlan Pike had whispered hung in the rafters like wood smoke, impossible to ignore. Elias moved through the days with a grim focus, checking the horses, sharpening tools, and watching the ridge line. But in the evenings, when the wind died down and the fire crackled in the stove, his eyes always found Willa. She was restless, pacing the small floor, her hands constantly busy with mending or cleaning, as if stopping would let the fear catch her. On the third night, while the sleet tapped against the window pane, Elias set down his whittling knife. "Tell me about the spurs." "Willa," he said softly. Willa froze by the shelf where she was stacking tin plates. She did not turn around. "I told you," she said, her voice tight. "It was a raid. That is what the sheriff wrote down." "I do not care what the sheriff wrote," Elias said. "I care what you saw. You said you saw silver spurs. Pike's men wear them. Tell me the rest." Willa gripped the edge of the shelf until her knuckles turned white. For 10 years, she had pushed the memory down, burying it under layers of survival and silence. To speak it aloud felt like inviting the fire back in. But then she looked at Elias. He was not looking at her with pity, as she had feared. He was looking at her with the steady, waiting patience of a man who had seen his own share of hell and knew that the only way out was through. It was late. Willa began, her voice barely a whisper. The wind was howling, just like tonight. Pa was reading the Bible by the fire. Ma was sewing. I was supposed to be asleep in the loft, but I was watching them through the cracks in the floorboards. She turned slowly, her eyes unfocused, seeing a different room, a different time. The dogs didn't bark. She said, That was the first thing. They must have killed the dogs first. Then the door burst open. There were 4 of them. They wore masks made of flour sacks with holes cut for eyes. Elias sat perfectly still, letting her pour the poison out. Pa stood up. Willa continued, her voice trembling. He reached for his rifle above the mantel. He never touched it. The first man. He shot Pa in the chest. Just like that. No words. No warning. Pa fell back into the fire. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the heat of the stove. Ma screamed. She tried to run for the back door, but another man caught her. He hit her hard. She fell. I wanted to scream. Elias, I wanted to jump down and help them, but I couldn't move. I was frozen. Ma looked up at the loft, right at me, and she put a finger to her lips. She told me to be quiet with her eyes. Willa squeezed her eyes shut, a tear escaping to track through the soot on her cheek. They poured coal oil on the floor, on the curtains. One of them struck a match. The fire went up so fast. It was like the world turned orange. As they turned to leave, the firelight caught the heels of the man who shot my father. I saw them, silver spurs, with a rowel shaped like a star. The Lazy P, Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. The next day, Pike came to town, Willa said, opening her eyes. He told everyone it was a tragedy. He told them he had found the bodies. He claimed the land was abandoned, said he bought the debt from the bank. And because I was gone, because I ran into the hills and hid in a cave like a wounded animal, they said I was part of it, or that I had gone mad. She looked at him, her expression defiant and broken. I learned something that night. Elias. The law is just a story men tell to justify what they take. And safety is a lie. The only thing you can trust is the high ground and a loaded gun. Elias stood up. He crossed the room and stood before her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a shelter. You are wrong, Willa, he said. She looked up, startled. Wrong? You are not alone anymore, he said. He turned and paced to the window, staring out at the darkness. I know about the ghosts, he said. I carry enough of them to fill a graveyard. He rested his forehead against the cold glass. I was a scout for the Union. He said, 3rd Regiment. I thought I was fighting for something noble, freedom, union. But out on the plains, after the war, it was different. We were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting families. He turned to face her, his face shadowed. I led a column to a village on the Sand Creek. The commander told us it was a war party. He showed us the maps. He gave the orders. When we got there, it was old men, women, children. Elias's voice cracked. I tried to stop it. I rode to the major, told him it was a mistake. He looked at me like I was a bug he wanted to crush. He said orders were orders. I watched men I had messed with, men I had shared coffee with, turn into butchers. I didn't fire a shot, Willa, but I didn't stop them either. I couldn't. He looked down at his hands, scarred and strong. I walked away from the army that day. I left my uniform in the dirt. I have been drifting ever since, because I figured a man who stands by and watches hell happen doesn't deserve a home. I thought I was just as bad as the men who pulled the triggers. Willa moved then. She crossed the gap between them. She reached out and took his hand, her rough, calloused fingers wrapping around his. You are not like them, she said fiercely. You are here. You are standing between me and Pike. That is not the act of a man without a soul. They stood there in the quiet cabin, their hands joined, the weight of their pasts laid out on the floorboards between them. The shame and the grief were still there, but they were shared now. And in the sharing, they became lighter. Over the next few days, the air in the cabin shifted. The tension remained, but the sharp edges of it were gone. They moved around each other with a new ease, a domestic familiarity that felt dangerous and sweet. When Elias chopped wood, Willa would pause in her work to watch the play of muscles in his back. When Willa cooked, Elias would stand close enough that his arm brushed hers as he reached for the salt. They traded small smiles over the rim of coffee cups. It was a fragile piece, built on the edge of a precipice. One evening, as they sat cleaning their rifles, Elias spoke the thought that had been turning in his mind. "We have to find Ben Carter," he said. Willa looked up from her Winchester. "The miner? The old man. Jeb said Carter was there that night." Elias said, "He said Carter has a conscience. If we can find him, if we can get him to testify before a judge, we can hang Pike." Willa lowered the rifle. "Hang Pike?" "Elias, Pike owns the judge. He owns the sheriff. He does not own the territory marshals," Elias said. "If we have a witness, a man who rode with him, we can bypass the local law. We can take it to Denver." Willa bit her lip. It sounded like a fairy tale. Justice coming down from the mountain to strike the wicked. But looking at Elias, seeing the set of his jaw, she felt a flicker of hope that terrified her. To hope was to risk disappointment, and she didn't know if she could survive another loss. But to do nothing, that is just waiting for him to burn us out, she whispered. "Exactly," Elias said. "We take the fight to him." Before they could form a plan, the war came to them. It was a Tuesday afternoon, unseasonably warm. The sun had turned the snow to slush, and the air smelled of wet pine and mud. Willa was up the ridge, checking a snare line she had set for rabbits. Elias was in the clearing below the cabin, splitting firewood. The rhythmic crack of the axe against the log echoed through the valley. He stopped mid-swing, his head snapping up. The sound of hoofbeats. Heavy and fast. Elias dropped the axe and grabbed his Henry rifle, which was leaning against a stump. He scanned the tree line. Riders, 4 of them, coming up the trail from the south. He looked up toward the ridge where Willa was. He couldn't let them see her. If Pike's men knew she was here, alone with him, they would use her to get to him. Or worse. He whistled, a sharp, 2-note signal they had agreed upon. "Stay hidden. Up on the ridge." Willa froze. She crouched behind a boulder, clutching her knife, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched through the branches as 4 men rode into the clearing. It was Dutch, Pike's foreman, and 3 of the hired guns from town. They rode good horses, well fed and rested. They fanned out, circling Elias, their hands resting on their saddle horns. "Afternoon," Dutch called out. He had a voice like grinding stones. Elias did not lower the rifle. He held it across his chest, his finger outside the trigger guard, but ready. "You are trespassing," Elias said calmly. Dutch laughed. "Trespassing? On whose land? This here is open range. Drifter, or maybe it belongs to the Lazy P. The lines get mighty blurry up here." "What do you want?" Elias asked. "Just checking on things," Dutch said, his eyes roaming over the cabin, the woodpile, the drying rack. "The boss wanted to make sure you were comfortable. He worries about folks living so far from civilization. Accidents happen. You know, I recall him saying that." Elias said, "Tell Mr. Pike I am comfortable enough, and tell him I don't scare easy." Dutch leaned forward in his saddle, chewing on the end of a cigar. "You got a female up here with you?" he asked, leering. "The wild girl?" "We smelled cooking. I live alone." Elias lied smoothly. Dutch stared at him, his eyes hard beads of flint. He didn't believe him, but with Elias holding a repeating rifle in the high ground, he wasn't going to push it. Not today. Dutch lit a match on his saddle horn. He puffed on his cigar until the tip glowed cherry red. "You know, Ward," he said, blowing a stream of smoke into the clear air. "Fire is a funny thing. It warms a man one minute and eats his world the next. You ought to be careful with your ashes." He flicked the match. It was a small gesture, casual, but deliberate. The match arched through the air and landed in a patch of dry bracken fern near the edge of the clearing. The dead ferns, dried out by the wind despite the melting snow, caught instantly. A small tongue of orange flame licked up. Dutch grinned. "See you around, Ward." He wheeled his horse and spurred it. The other riders followed, laughing as they galloped back down the trail. Elias didn't watch them go. He dropped the rifle and ran for the fire. "Water!" he shouted, though he knew Willa was too far away to hear. He stomped on the flames with his heavy boots, but the wind caught the spark. It jumped from the ferns to a dry juniper bush. The bush went up with a whoosh of exploding resin. Willa came scrambling down the ridge, sliding on the scree. She saw the smoke billowing up, black and oily. "The shovels!" she screamed. They fought the fire for 3 hours. It was a brutal, desperate battle. The wind drove the flames up the slope, away from the cabin but into the heart of the timber Willa had hunted for years. They used shovels, blankets, and raw desperation to beat back the line. The smoke choked them, stinging their eyes and filling their lungs with soot. The heat was a physical blow, singing their eyebrows and blistering their skin. They cut a firebreak, digging a trench through the rocky soil until their hands bled. Elias swung the axe like a madman, felling small trees to starve the fire of fuel. Willa threw dirt until her shoulders screamed, finally. As the sun dipped below the peaks, the wind died. The fire, robbed of its momentum, sputtered and slowed against the wet snow of the higher elevation. They stood amidst the ruin. A blackened scar stretched up the hillside, acres of trees reduced to smoking skeletons. The smell of charred wood was overpowering. The cabin was safe, but the sanctuary was violated. Willa dropped her shovel. She stood in the middle of the blackened earth, her face streaked with soot and sweat, her chest heaving. She looked at the dead trees. She looked at the smoke curling up like accusing fingers. It was too much, the fatigue, the fear, the constant vigilance, the memory of her parents' burning home. It all crashed down on her at once. She let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "I am so tired," she cried, her voice cracking. She sank to her knees in the ash. "I am so tired of fighting," she sobbed, covering her face with her black-stained hands. "Every time I build something, every time I find a safe place, they take it, they burn it. Why can't they just let me be?" Elias threw his shovel aside. He crossed the blackened ground in 3 long strides. He dropped to his knees beside her. He didn't speak. He just reached out and pulled her into him. Willa stiffened for a second, her body rigid with the instinct to pull away, to hide her weakness, but the warmth of him was too much to resist. She collapsed against his chest, her hands clutching the front of his shirt, twisting the fabric in her desperation. She wept. She wept for her father, for her mother, for the girl she had been, and for the hard, lonely woman she had become. She wept until she had no tears left, only dry, racking shudders. Elias held her. He rested his cheek on the top of her soot-stained hair. He rocked her gently, murmuring words that didn't make sense but meant everything. "I have got you," he whispered. "I am here. They didn't get the cabin. They didn't get us." He rubbed her back, his hand large and warm and steady. "I won't let them take any more." "Willa," he vowed, his voice rough with smoke and emotion. "I swear it." Willa pulled back slightly. She looked up at him. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face a mask of dirt and tears. But to Elias, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was raw and real and alive. The intensity in her gaze shifted. The grief burned down. And something else flared up in its place, a desperate need, a hunger to affirm life in the face of all this death. "Elias," she whispered. She reached up, her hand trembling, and touched his cheek. Her thumb traced the line of his jaw. Elias stopped breathing. He looked at her mouth, then at her eyes. He saw the permission there. He saw the want. He leaned in. Their lips met. It wasn't a tentative, testing kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of smoke and salt and desperation. Willa made a small noise in her throat and pressed herself closer, her arms going around his neck, pulling him down to her. Elias groaned, his hands tangling in her hair, holding her face. The kiss deepened, becoming hungry, urgent. It was the release of months of tension, of cold nights lying back to back, of shared danger and unspoken longing. It was a claiming. For a long minute, the world narrowed down to the heat of their mouths and the pounding of their hearts. The fire on the hill was forgotten. The threat of pike was forgotten. There was only this, then, slowly, they pulled apart. They were both breathing hard, their foreheads resting against each other. Elias's hands were still cupping her face. Willa's hands were gripping his shoulders. Willa's eyes were wide, the pupils blown dark. Fear flickered there again, but it was a different kind of fear. "I'm afraid," she whispered. Elias stroked her cheek with his thumb. "Of Pike?" "No," she said. Of wanting you." She lowered her gaze. "In this world, men take— Elias, they take what they want, and women pay the price. Desire is a trap. If I let myself want you, and then I lose you, I will not survive it. I will break." Elias put a finger under her chin and lifted her face until she had to look at him. "Listen to me. Willa, I am not a man who takes, and I am not a man who leaves." He leaned in, brushing his lips against her forehead. "Whatever happens between us, it is your choice, and it is my choice. We are not trapped. We are choosing this. We are choosing each other." Willa searched his face. She saw the truth there. He was offering her something she had never had: agency, partnership. She let out a long, shaky breath. "I choose you," she whispered. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, relief washing over him. "Then I am yours." He stood up, pulling her to her feet. "Come inside," he said. "The wind is picking up." They walked back to the cabin, leaving the blackened hillside behind them. Inside, the air was still warm. They washed the soot from their faces with water from the bucket. The intimacy of the act, Elias wiping a smudge from her nose, Willa handing him the towel, felt profound. They sat on the edge of the bed, their knees touching. The danger outside had clarified everything. "We cannot stay here," Willa said quietly. "The fire showed us that. If we stay, he will just burn us out, or shoot us from the trees." Elias nodded. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "We have to go to Oro City," he said. "We have to find Ben Carter. It is a 3-day ride," Willa said, "through the pass. And if Pike's men catch us on the trail, we will be ready for them." Elias said, "We know the land better than they do." He squeezed her hand. "We get the proof. We take it to the marshals in Denver. We bring the law down on Pike's head. And then—" "Then?" Willa asked. "Then we come back." Elias said, "We rebuild what he burned. And we live in peace." Willa looked around the cabin. It was all she had. But looking at Elias, she realized that home wasn't the logs or the roof. It was the hand holding hers. "We leave at dawn," she said. Elias nodded. At dawn, they lay down on the bed, fully clothed, exhausted beyond measure. But this time, there was no hesitation. Elias pulled her against him, and Willa curled into his embrace. They slept with their weapons within reach, but for the first time, they were not sleeping alone. They were a team, and they were going to war. The dawn arrived not with the promise of warmth, but with a steely, gray indifference that turned the snow-crusted valley into a landscape of bone and charcoal. Inside the cabin, the air was still and cold, stripped of the domestic warmth that had grown between them over the long winter months. Elias Ward stood by the table, packing saddlebags with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent half his life on the move. He rolled the dried beef into tight bundles, wrapped the small bag of coffee in oilcloth, and measured out the last of the flour. It was not much, barely enough for 3 days if they rationed it, but hunger was a familiar companion to them both. Willa moved through the room like a ghost haunting her own home. She touched the rough-hewn mantel, the iron stove, the window frame where the frost had furned into delicate patterns. She was gathering her few treasures. Into a soft buckskin pouch went a small knife with a bone handle, a spare box of matches, and the silver locket that had belonged to her mother. She held the locket for a moment, the metal cold against her palm. Before tucking it deep inside her coat pocket, the cabin felt strangely small. For years, it had been her fortress, vast enough to hold her silence. Now, knowing that Harlan Pike's eyes were fixed on it, knowing that his riders had already violated the tree line with fire, the walls felt thin. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. Elias hefted the saddlebags over his shoulder. "The horses are ready," he said quietly. Willa nodded. She picked up a piece of charcoal from the cold stove, turning the blackened wood in her fingers. She walked to the heavy timber door. On the inside of the wood, at eye level. She pressed the charcoal hard against the grain. She drew a simple, stark image. A semicircle rising over a jagged triangle, half sun, half mountain. Elias watched her, pausing with his hand on the latch. "What is that?" "It is a mark," Willa said, her voice low. "The Ute band I lived with used it. It means this place is not abandoned. It means it is watched over. It means it is claimed." She stepped back, wiping the black dust from her fingers onto her trousers. "If Pike burns it down, he burns it down," she said. "But he will know he did not drive me out. He will know I intend to come back." Elias looked at the rough drawing, then at the woman standing in the gray light. He understood. She was not just claiming the logs and the stone. She was claiming the right to exist in this valley. She was claiming the future they were riding out to fight for. He nodded once, a solemn acknowledgement. "We will come back," he said. They stepped out into the biting wind, leaving the door unlocked but the message clear. The journey to Oro City was a gauntlet thrown down by the Rockies. The trail wound upward out of the valley, crossing the spine of the range where the air was so thin it made the lungs burn with every breath. The west showed its teeth that day. The wind screamed through the high passes, driving needles of ice into their faces. The path was treacherous, a narrow shelf of slick granite with a 1,000-foot drop on one side and a sheer wall on the other. They moved as a single unit. Willa took the lead, her eyes reading the terrain with an instinct honed by a decade of survival. She spotted the patches of unstable snow before the horses could step on them. She found the game trails that bypassed the deepest drifts. Elias rode rearguard, his eyes constantly scanning the back trail. He watched for the flash of a lens, the movement of a horse, the unnatural flight of birds that signaled pursuers. He read the silence as well as he read the noise. They did not speak much. The wind stole their words, and the sheer effort of the ride required all their focus. But in the quiet moments, when they stopped to water the horses at an icy meltwater stream, or when they dismounted to lead the animals over a particularly bad stretch of scree, their teamwork was seamless. Elias would reach out to steady her horse. Willa would hand him a strip of jerky without him asking. They moved around each other with a fluid grace, two solitary creatures who had learned the rhythm of a pack. On the second night, they made camp in a dense grove of spruce trees. Sheltered from the worst of the wind, they built a small fire, keeping it low to avoid casting a beacon into the night. The temperature plummeted. The cold was a physical weight, pressing in from the darkness. They sat close to the fire, their shoulders touching. Elias poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the steam rising in the frigid air. "How far?" Willa asked, wrapping her hands around the hot metal. "We should make the ridge above the mining camp by noon tomorrow," Elias said. "Then we go in on foot." Willa stared into the flames. She looked tired, the skin around her eyes tight with exhaustion. "You think he will be there?" she asked. "This Ben Carter? Men like that are creatures of habit," Elias said. "If he is drinking to forget, he will be where the whiskey is cheap and the lights are low." Willa took a sip of the bitter coffee. "I have never been to a mining camp. I hear they are hell on earth." "They are close enough," Elias admitted. "Greed makes men ugly, Willa, and desperation makes them dangerous. You keep your hat low. You let me do the talking until we find him." Willa looked at him sideways. "I can handle myself." "Ward, I know you can," Elias said, nudging her shoulder gently with his own. "But I would prefer not to have to shoot my way out of a saloon before we even get the information we need." Willa smiled, a small, fleeting expression that softened the hard lines of her face. They fell into a comfortable silence. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling up toward the canopy of branches. Elias stretched his legs out toward the warmth. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "sometimes I think about what I would do if I wasn't drifting. If I stopped running." Willa looked at him. "What would you do?" Elias shrugged, looking embarrassed. "It is a foolish dream, but I think about a piece of the land, not big, just enough for a small herd. Good water, maybe near the timberline, where the air is clean, like the valley," Willa said softly. "Like the valley," Elias agreed. "I would raise horses, sturdy mountain stock, Animals that know how to handle the rough ground? He looked at her. What about you? Do you dream of anything other than traps and hides? Willa was quiet for a long time. She drew her knees up to her chest. I dream of sleeping, she said finally. Sleeping? Sleeping without one eye open, Willa explained. I dream of walking into town and not having people look at me like I am a rabid dog. I dream of sitting on a porch, just sitting, and watching the sun go down without worrying who is in the shadows. She turned her head, meeting his gaze. I dream of being safe. Elias. That is all. Just safe. Elias reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm and rough and solid. We will get there, he promised. We get the proof. We break Pike, and you will have your porch. Willa squeezed his hand back. And you will have your horses, she said. They sat there as the fire burned down to coals, holding onto the shared vision of a future that felt both impossibly distant and close enough to touch. When the cold became unbearable, they spread their bedrolls together, sharing the blankets and the heat of their bodies, sleeping under the vast, indifferent sky not as strangers, but as partners. Oro City was a scar on the side of the mountain. It was a sprawl of canvas tents, shanties built from packing crates, and log structures that leaned drunkenly into the mud. The main street was a quagmire of filth, churned by heavy wagons hauling silver ore. The air smelled of sulfur, unwashed bodies, rotting garbage, and the metallic tang of crushed rock. It was a place where hope went to die, replaced by the frantic, feverish hunger for silver. Elias and Willa left the horses in a thicket of aspen a mile outside of town. They walked in, boots heavy with mud. Willa pulled the brim of her hat down low, hiding her eyes. Her collar turned up against the wind and the stairs. The noise hit them first. The clamor of the stamp mills crushing ore, the shouting of teamsters, the tinny sound of a piano coming from one of the canvas saloons. Keep close, Elias murmured. They moved through the crowd. Men with faces gray from rock dust shoved past them. Mules plodded along, heads down. It was a chaotic, violent hive. They found the place Jeb had described, a low, sprawling structure called the Lucky Strike. It was more permanent than the tents, built of solid logs, but it looked just as disreputable. Elias pushed open the swinging doors. The interior was dim, lit by smoky kerosene lamps. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of cheap rye whiskey. Men crowded the bar and the gaming tables, their voices a dull roar. Elias scanned the room. He was looking for a man who didn't want to be found, a man hiding from his own memory. There, Elias said, nodding toward a dark corner in the back. A man sat alone at a small, wobbly table. He was slumped over a glass, his head resting in his hands. He wore clothes that had once been decent cowboy gear but were now stained and worn. A bottle stood before him, half empty. They made their way through the crowd. Willa felt the eyes of the miners on her. Curious, predatory glances, but she kept her hand near the knife under her coat and followed Elias's broad back. They stopped at the table. Ben Carter? Elias asked. The man flinched. His head snapped up. He was young, maybe 30, but his face was ravaged by drink and lack of sleep. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with red. He looked at Elias with a mixture of fear and confusion. Who's asking? Ben rasped. A friend of the truth, Elias said. He pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. Willa took the chair next to him, keeping her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room. I am not buying whatever you are selling, Ben muttered, reaching for his bottle. And I ain't hiring out. My writing days are done. We are not here to hire you, Elias said. We are here to talk about the Lazy P. And a night 10 years ago, Ben froze. His hand hovered over the glass. The color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old parchment. I don't know what you are talking about, he whispered. Go away. We are talking about the Kane homestead, Elias said, pressing. We are talking about a fire, and a little girl who vanished. Ben slammed his hand on the table. Shut up, he hissed, looking around wildly. You want to get me killed? I want to know why you did it, Willa said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the noise of the saloon like a blade. Ben turned his head slowly to look at her. He peered at her through the gloom and the haze of alcohol. He looked at her eyes, dark, fierce, familiar. His mouth fell open. "You," he breathed. It can't be. You are dead. I am very much alive." Willa said, "No thanks to you." Ben scrambled back in his chair, as if he were seeing a ghost. I didn't." "You rode with them," Willa said. "You were there when they killed my father, when they killed my mother." Ben put his hands over his face. "God help me. I was there, but I didn't shoot them. I swear it. I was just a kid." Pike said we were just going to scare them off." He looked up, tears leaking from his eyes. "When the shooting started, it was madness. I saw your PA fall. I saw your ma." He swallowed hard, shaking his head. "Then I saw you," Ben whispered. "Up in the loft. I saw your face in the shadows. You were looking right at me." Willa held her breath. She remembered the eyes. "The silver spurs?" Pike shouted to kill the witnesses. Ben said he pointed up at the loft. "He told me to shoot." Ben looked at his hands, trembling on the table. "I couldn't do it. I couldn't shoot a child. So I fired into the roof. I yelled that I got you. I told Pike you were dead." Willa stared at him. The memory shifted. The shot she had heard, the one she thought was meant for her, had been a lie, a mercy. You saved me?" she whispered. Ben let out a jagged sob. "I let you run. I watched you go out the back window into the snow. I prayed you would freeze, because it seemed kinder than what Pike would do if he found you." He reached into his dirty coat. "I couldn't stay after that," Ben said. "I took this. I stole it from Pike's saddlebag that night. I thought maybe one day I would have the guts to show it to someone." He pulled out a crumpled, stained piece of paper and slid it across the table. Elias took it. It was a page torn from a ledger. The handwriting was elegant, precise. December 12th, 1869. Acquisition of cane parcel. Obstacles removed. $40 paid to crew. Obstacles removed. Elias read, his voice cold as ice. That is what he called a family. Obstacles. This proves it, Willa said, touching the paper. "It proves he ordered it." Ben nodded. "It proves it. But who's going to believe a drunk miner and a ghost?" "We will make them believe," Elias said. He folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "You are coming with us." "Ben, we are going to Denver." "Denver?" Ben laughed hysterically. "Pike will kill us before we get 10 miles. Elias started to stand. "We will protect you, but you have to—" The front door of the saloon burst open. It wasn't a patron entering. It was an invasion. Dutch, the foreman, stood in the doorway, a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. Behind him were 3 other men. Dusters swept back to reveal tied-down holsters. Dutch scanned the room, his eyes locked onto the corner table. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Well, look at this," Dutch shouted. "A family reunion." Elias reacted instantly. "Get down," he roared. He shoved Willa hard, knocking her chair backward. She hit the floor just as Dutch pulled the trigger. The shotgun blast shredded the table where they had been sitting. Wood splinters and glass exploded outward. The noise was deafening in the enclosed space. Pandemonium erupted. Miners dove for cover, overturning tables. The piano player stopped abruptly. Elias rolled, drawing his Colt Navy. He fired twice. One of Pike's men spun around, clutching his shoulder. "Move!" Elias shouted to Willa. "The back door!" Willa scrambled to her feet, grabbing Ben by the collar. Ben was frozen in terror. "Come on," she screamed, dragging him up. Dutch racked the slide of his shotgun. Elias fired again, forcing Dutch to duck behind a pillar. Willa hauled Ben toward the rear exit, weaving through the chaos of screaming men and flying debris. Elias covered them, walking backward, firing carefully, suppressing the gunmen at the door. They burst out the back door into a narrow, muddy alley. The air was cold and shocked their lungs. "Run!" Elias yelled. They sprinted down the alley, slipping in the muck. Behind them, the saloon door banged open. "There they go!" Dutch's voice bellowed. "Cut them down!" Bullets whistled past them, thudding into the wooden walls of the shacks. Thwack! Thwack! Ben let out a yelp and stumbled. I am hit! Keep moving! Willa grabbed his arm, hauling him upright. It is just a graze. Move! They turned a corner, diving behind a stack of crates. Elias stopped, leaning around the corner to fire 3 rapid shots back down the alley. He heard a curse and a cry of pain. That bought them a few seconds. Into the ravine, Elias ordered, pointing toward the edge of town where the ground dropped away into a dark, brush-filled gully. They ran for the edge and jumped. They slid down the steep bank, tearing their clothes on brambles, tumbling through the darkness until they hit the bottom. They lay there in the mud, gasping for air. Above them, they could hear heavy boots pounding on the boardwalks, shouts, and the occasional searching gunshot. Stay down, Elias whispered, his hand on Willa's back. They pressed themselves into the shadows of the ravine wall. Willa could feel Elias's heart pounding against her side. She could smell the gunpowder on him, sharp and acrid. Ben was whimpering softly, clutching his arm. They were alive. But they were hunted. They moved 2 miles down the ravine before they dared to stop. They found a small overhang, a shallow cave hidden by scrub oak, and huddled inside. It was pitch black. Elias risked lighting a single match to look at Ben's arm. The bullet had torn a furrow through the fleshy part of his bicep. It was bleeding, but it wasn't deep. Willa ripped a strip from her shirt tail. Hold still, she said, binding the wound tight. Ben winced, his face pale in the flickering matchlight. They found us, he whispered. They knew we were coming. Pike has eyes everywhere, Elias said grimly. He blew out the match. They sat in the darkness. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, shaking exhaustion. We have the ledger, Elias said, tapping his pocket. And we have Ben, but we can't go to Denver, Willa said. Not now. They will be watching the passes. They will cut us off before we get out of the high country. Elias was silent for a moment. She was right. Pike would have riders on every trail leading out of the mountains. They were boxed in. There is only one place to go, Elias said. Willa looked at him in the dark. She felt the weight of his words before he spoke them. Blackwood, she said. We go back, Elias said. We take Ben and the ledger straight to the town. We put it in front of the people, in front of the judge, in the daylight. It is suicide, Ben moaned. Pike runs that town. He runs it because people are afraid, Elias said. He runs it on lies. If we show them the truth, if we force them to look at it, maybe the fear breaks. And if it doesn't, Willa asked quietly, then we die fighting, Elias said. But we stop running. Willa sat back against the rock. She touched the pocket where her mother's locket lay. She thought about the charcoal mark on her door. Claimed. We go back, she said. The night dragged on. Ben fell into a fitful, moaning sleep. Elias and Willa sat near the entrance of the overhang, watching the stars wheel overhead through the branches. The fire in them had burned down to embers, leaving a quiet, somber intimacy. They knew what tomorrow meant. It was a coin toss with death. Willa shifted, leaning her head against Elias's shoulder. He didn't pull away. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, his hand resting on her arm. Are you afraid? She asked softly. Yes, Elias said. I am terrified. For yourself? For you, he said. I have spent my whole life walking away from things. Willa, now that I have found something I want to stand for, the thought of losing it scares me more than any bullet. Willa turned her face into his coat. She breathed in the scent of him, leather, sweat, tobacco, and the clean smell of the snow. I lived 10 years in silence. She whispered. I was a ghost in my own life. I would rather have one day, one single day, of living the truth with you than 100 years of hiding in that cave alone. Elias tightened his grip. He turned his head, pressing his lips to her hair. We are not hiding anymore, he said. They sat there as the night deepened. 2 outcasts huddled in the dirt, armed with nothing but a scrap of paper and a jagged, stubborn love. The odds were impossible. The enemy was powerful. But as Elias held her, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, he knew he had made his choice. He would not drift anymore. He was anchored here, with her, And tomorrow, they would make the world listen. The sun did not rise so much as it bled into the sky, a pale, anemic wash of light that did little to warm the frozen mud of the trail. The peaks to the west, usually jagged and distinct, were soft gray blurs against the heavy clouds. It was a Sunday morning, the kind of day that felt held breath, waiting for the wind to drop or the first gunshot to crack the silence. Elias Ward rode on the left, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. His Henry rifle was scabbarded but loose, the leather thong untied. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, vibrating with the same tension that had lived in his marrow since the war. He was mentally sketching the layout of the town in his head, the alley behind the livery, the sight lines from the hotel balcony, the places a man with a rifle could hide and wait. Willa rode beside him, her posture rigid. She wore her patched buckskin coat, but beneath it, pressed against the thrumming beat of her heart, was the crumpled page from Pike's ledger and the silver locket that had been cold against her mother's throat the night she died. She fingered the outline of the metal through the cloth. It was a talisman. It was proof. It was the anchor that kept her from drifting away into the terrifying vastness of what they were about to do. Ben Carter rode a length behind them, slumped in his saddle. His face was the color of old parchment, slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. His wounded arm was bound tight against his chest, but it was the fear that was bleeding him dry. He looked like a man riding to his own hanging, and perhaps he was. "We are close," Elias said, his voice low. Willa nodded. She could smell the coal smoke from the town chimneys. It tasted bitter on her tongue. "Remember," Elias said, shifting his gaze to her, "we do not stop at the sheriff's office. Pike owns the sheriff. We go where the people are. We make them hear it before Pike can silence us." "The church," Willa said. "The church," Elias agreed. "It is Sunday. They will all be there, pretending to be good." They rode into Blackwood as the church bell began to toll. The sound was mournful, a slow, iron heartbeat that echoed off the valley walls. The main street was largely empty. The mud churned and frozen into ruts. A few stragglers were hurrying toward the white-clapboard building at the end of the street, clutching Bibles and pulling shawls tight against the wind. They dismounted at the hitching rail. Elias tied Banjo loosely, ready for a quick escape if things went south. He helped Ben down. The miner stumbled, his knees weak, but Elias gripped his good arm with bruising force. "Stand up. Ben," Elias hissed. "You are the only weapon we have that shoots straight today." Willa took a deep breath. She looked at the town that had scorned her, the windows that had closed against her, the street where she had walked with her head down for 10 years. She lifted her chin. She touched the handle of her knife, then let her hand fall to her side. "Ready?" she asked. Elias looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he saw the steel underneath it. "Ready," he said. They walked up the wooden steps. The double doors were open. The sound of a hymn drifted out. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me." They stepped inside. The warmth hit them first, thick with the smell of damp wool, beeswax candles, and body heat. The church was full. Ranchers with sun-reddened necks sat beside shopkeepers in stiff collars, wives in their Sunday best hushed children who squirmed on the hard pews. At the front, the preacher, a thin man with spectacles, was leading the singing. Elias, Willa, and Ben stood at the back of the nave. They were a jarring sight, dirty, travel-worn, smelling of horse sweat and wood smoke. Dust from the road clung to their clothes like a second skin. The singing faltered. It started at the back rows. People turned, sensing the disturbance. Eyes widened, elbows nudged ribs. The hymn died away, row by row, until only the preacher was left singing, his voice cracking on a high note before trailing off into silence. The church went deathly quiet. The only sound was the wind rattling the window panes and Ben's ragged breathing. Willa stood tall. She felt the weight of 100 stares, scorn, curiosity, fear. Then, the front pew shifted. Harlan Pike stood up. He was dressed in a fine black suit. His silver hair brushed back, looking every inch the benevolent patriarch. He turned slowly, a hymn book still in his hand. His eyes swept over the intruders. He saw Ben, pale and shaking. He saw Elias, hand resting near his gun. And he saw Willa. For a second, Pike's mask slipped. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face, followed instantly by a cold, calculating rage, but he smoothed it over with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Kane," Pike said, his voice booming in the acoustic space, "and Mr. Ward, you have chosen a strange time to interrupt our worship." He stepped into the aisle, confident, owning the room. "We are accustomed to your wild ways," Pike said, "addressing the congregation as much as her. But bringing your ruffian friends and your filth into the house of the Lord, that is a new low, even for you." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. A woman in the third row sniffed loudly. "We are not here to pray." "Pike," Willa said. Her voice rang out. It was not the scratchy, unused voice of the hermit girl. It was clear and sharp as a bell. "We are here to testify," she said. Pike chuckled. A dry, dismissive sound. "Testify? You? My dear girl, you are hysterical. The winter has clearly addled your wits. You should go back to your cave before you embarrass yourself further." He waved a hand at the sheriff, who was sitting near the front. "Sheriff, perhaps you could escort Miss Kane and her companions out? They seem unwell." The sheriff, a thick-set man with a mustache that hid a weak chin, started to rise. "Sit down," Elias barked. The command cracked like a whip. Elias stepped forward, his hand resting openly on the butt of his Colt. The sheriff froze, halfway out of his seat. "We are not leaving," Elias said. "Not until you hear what Ben Carter has to say?" Pike's eyes narrowed. He looked at Ben. "Carter, is that you? I heard you had drunk yourself into a stupor over in Oro City. You look like death warmed over." "Son." Ben stepped forward. He was trembling so hard the pew he leaned against vibrated. He looked at Pike, the man he had feared for a decade. Then he looked at Willa. He saw the child in the loft. He saw the woman who had dragged him through gunfire to save his life. "I'm sober enough." "Pike," Ben said. His voice shook, but it carried. He looked out at the faces of the townspeople, people he had grown up with. "I was there," Ben said, 10 years ago, December 12th. Pike took a step forward. "Ben, you are clearly drunk. Do not say another word." "I was there," Ben shouted, his voice cracking. "I rode with the Lazy P crew. Pike led us." Gasps filled the room. The preacher took off his spectacles, looking bewildered. "It wasn't Indians," Ben said, tears starting to track through the dust on his face. "There was no raid. It was us. Pike ordered it. He wanted the water rights. He told us to burn them out." Pike's face turned a mottled red. "Liar," he roared. "This man is a drunkard and a thief. I fired him for stealing. I saw him shoot John Kane. Ben yelled over him. I saw Dutch shoot Mrs. Kane. And then Pike. He told us to burn the house. He told us to kill the girl." The silence in the church was absolute. It was a horrified, suffocating vacuum. People shifted in their seats, looking from Pike to Ben. They had heard the rumors for years, whispers in the saloon, quiet doubts over kitchen tables. But to hear it spoken aloud, in the daylight, in the church, it shattered the comfortable lie they had all agreed to live with. Pike looked around. He saw the doubt creeping into the eyes of his neighbors. He saw the way the banker pulled his coat away from him. He was losing them. He turned on Elias, his eyes venomous. "This is your doing, drifter." Pike spat. "You put him up to this. You are trying to shake me down. You poisoned this town against me because I wouldn't hire you. I don't want your money, Pike," Elias said calmly. "I want the truth." He pulled the ledger page from his pocket and held it up. December 12th. Elias read, "Acquisition of Kane parcel. Obstacles removed. It is in your own hand." "Pike!" Pike's composure snapped. He looked at his men, Dutch and 2 others, who were standing near the side door. "Kill them!" Pike screamed. "They are lying! Kill them!" The church exploded into chaos. Women screamed and dove under pews. Men scrambled to get out of the line of fire. Dutch standing by the choir loft. drew his gun. Elias was moving before the command was fully out of Pike's mouth. He dove to the right, crashing into a pew, and fired. Bang! The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Dutch jerked backward, his shoulders shattering, his gun clattering to the floor. The other two gunmen drew. Elias rolled onto his back, firing upward. Wood splinters rained down as bullets chewed up the pew he was using for cover. "Get down!" Willa screamed, shoving Ben to the floor. Smoke filled the air instantly, acrid and blinding. The screams of the townsfolk mixed with the roar of the guns. Elias popped up, fired, and ducked back down. One of the gunmen spun away, clutching his leg. But in the confusion, Pike had moved, while Elias was pinned down. Pike lunged through the smoke. He grabbed Willa by her hair, jerking her upright. He jammed the barrel of a snub-nosed revolver into her ribs. "Drop it," Pike screamed. "Drop the gun. Ward, or I will blow a hole in her." The shooting stopped. The silence that rushed back in was ringing and terrible. The smoke drifted in lazy swirls through the shafts of sunlight coming from the high windows. Elias stood up slowly, his chest heaving. He saw Willa held tight against Pike's chest, the gun digging into her side. Pike's face was twisted into a rictus of desperation and hate. It felt like a nightmare repeating. The fire, the gun, the helpless girl. "Drop it," Pike panted. "Kick it over here." Elias hesitated. If he dropped the gun, they were both dead. If he shot, he might hit Willa. He looked at Willa. Her eyes met his. There was terror there. Yes, but there was no surrender. She was looking at him, and then her eyes flicked down to Pike's leg, then back to Elias. A signal. She was not the child in the loft anymore. She was the woman who had survived the winter. She was the woman who had claimed him. "Now!" she screamed. Willa slammed the heel of her boot backward with all her strength. She drove it into Pike's shin. Grinding down, Pike howled in pain. His grip loosening just a fraction, he flinched, the gun wavering. That was all the opening Elias needed. He didn't shoot. He charged. He crossed the 10 feet between them in a blur of motion. He hit Pike like a freight train, his shoulder driving into the man's chest. Bang! Pike's gun went off as they collided. Elias felt a searing burn across his left shoulder, like a hot poker being dragged across his skin. He ignored it. They crashed to the floor of the aisle. Pike was big, and he was fighting for his life. He clawed at Elias's face, trying to bring the gun back around. Elias smashed his forearm into Pike's wrist, pinning it to the wood. They struggled, grunting and cursing, boots thudding against the pews. Elias drove his knee into Pike's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He grabbed Pike's gun hand and twisted. There was a sickening pop, and Pike screamed, dropping the weapon. Elias grabbed him by the lapels of his fine black suit and hauled him up. He slammed him back against the altar rail. "Stay down!" Elias roared, drawing his own gun and pressing the muzzle under Pike's chin. Pike froze, his eyes bulging, his breath coming in wheezing gasps. The church was silent again. Slowly, tentatively, heads began to pop up from behind the pews. Elias stood there, blood seeping from the graze on his shoulder, his chest heaving. He held the most powerful man in the valley at gunpoint before the altar of God. "Look at him," Elias shouted to the town. "Look at the man who built your roads. Look at the man who owns your debt." He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out the ledger page again. He threw it onto the floor in front of the sheriff. "Read it," Elias commanded. The sheriff stood up slowly. He looked at Pike, then at the gun in Elias's hand. He bent down and picked up the paper. It says obstacles removed," the sheriff stammered. Ben Carter stood up from the back, holding his arm. "He killed them," Ben said into the silence. "He killed John and Martha Kane, and he tried to kill Willa." Pike looked around the room. "Help me," he rasped. "Sheriff, arrest this madman. He is holding a gun on me." The sheriff looked at Pike. He looked at the blood on the floor. He looked at the faces of the congregation. He saw the disgust. He saw the realization. The spell of fear that Pike had cast over the town for 10 years had broken. It hadn't shattered completely, but it was cracked beyond repair. The sheriff holstered his gun. "I can't do that, Harlan," the sheriff said quietly. Pike's jaw dropped. "You work for me. I work for the town," the sheriff said, finding a spine he hadn't known he possessed. "And the town has heard enough." The sheriff walked forward. He took a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. "Harlan Pike, you are under arrest," the sheriff said. Elias stepped back, lowering his gun. He kept his eyes on Pike until the cuffs clicked shut. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. He turned to look for Willa. She was standing near the front pew. Her hair was wild, her coat torn. She was shaking. Elias went to her. He didn't care about the people watching. He didn't care about the blood on his shoulder. He wrapped his good arm around her and pulled her close. "It is done," he whispered into her hair. "It is done." Willa buried her face in his chest. She didn't cry. She just held on, anchoring herself to the only solid thing in a world that had turned upside down. Justice in the West was rarely swift, and it was never clean. The days that followed were a blur of depositions and legal men arriving from the territory capital. Pike's empire did not crumble overnight, but the foundation was gone. The ledger, combined with Ben's sworn testimony and the corroboration of the wounded foreman who turned state's evidence to save his own neck, was enough to secure an indictment. Pike was taken to Denver in a wagon with barred windows. He did not look back at the town he had ruled. Ben Carter stayed long enough to sign the papers. He was a broken man, unable to bear the weight of the town's stares or his own guilt. He drifted out one morning before dawn, heading west, looking for a hole deep enough to hide his memories. The town itself was a strange place to be. There was no parade for Willa, no grand apology. The people of Blackwood were embarrassed. They were ashamed that they had been complicit in the lie for so long. It was easier to look away from Willa than to look her in the eye and admit they had been wrong. A week after the arrest, Willa stood on the edge of town, near the livery stable. She was watching the sun set over the western peaks. A woman walked by, the same rancher's wife who had pulled her skirts away in the store. She paused, looked at Willa, and gave a stiff, awkward nod. "Evening, Miss Kane," the woman said. "Evening," Willa replied. That was all, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement that she existed. Elias walked up beside her. He had his arm in a sling, but he was moving well. He watched the woman walk away. "They will come around," Elias said. "In time. I don't need them to," Willa said. She turned to look at the mountains. The peaks were bathed in alpenglow, burning pink and gold against the darkening sky. "I don't belong here. Elias," she said. "I tried to imagine it, living in a house with curtains, walking to church on Sundays. It feels like wearing a dress that is too tight." Elias nodded. He understood. The wildness wasn't just in the hills. It was in them. "So, what do you want?" he asked quietly. Willa looked at him. She saw the man who had ridden into hell for her, the man who had slept on her floor to keep her warm. "I want to go home," she said, "to the valley." Elias smiled. It was a slow, easy smile that reached his eyes. "I was hoping you would say that," he said. They rode back the next morning. The air was crisp, smelling of pine sap and melting snow. As they climbed higher, the mud of the town gave way to the clean, hard rock of the trail. When they crested the final ridge and looked down into the valley, they saw the scars of the fire. The hillside was black, a jagged wound on the landscape. But amidst the char, the green was already returning. Fireweed and saplings were pushing through the ash, feeding on the destruction to build something new. The cabin stood where they had left it, sturdy, resolute. They rode into the clearing. The door was still closed. Willa dismounted and walked to the door. The charcoal mark was still there, half sun, half mountain, faded by the wind, but visible. She pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, cold, and silent, but it was theirs. Elias walked in behind her. He shrugged off his heavy coat, wincing slightly as the movement pulled on his healing shoulder. He walked to the bed, the narrow, fur-piled bed that had been their refuge during the storm. He sat down on the edge of it and stretched his legs out. He looked up at Willa with a weary, contented grin. "You know," he said, his eyes twinkling, "I think I trust you enough now to sleep without my armor." Willa laughed. It was a genuine sound, rusty but real. She walked over to him. She stood between his knees, looking down at his scarred, handsome face. She remembered the stranger she had hauled up the mountain, half dead and naked. She remembered the fear. She remembered the loneliness. And she realized that those things were gone. She sat down beside him. She leaned over and rested her forehead against his. "If you are here, Elias Ward," she whispered, "it is because I choose you, and you choose me." Elias reached up and touched her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I choose you," he said. Every day, night fell over the valley. The wind picked up, howling around the eaves, carrying the bite of the lingering winter. But inside the cabin, the stove was lit. The lamp cast a warm, golden circle of light against the dark logs. Elias drifted toward sleep, his breathing deepening. He did not reach for his gun. He did not flinch at the sound of the wind. Willa lay beside him, her head on his chest. She traced the lines of his hand with her fingers, the lifeline, the heart line, the scars that crossed them both. The world outside was still hard. The west was not safe. Pike was gone. But there would be other men, other storms, other fires. But as she listened to the steady, strong beat of Elias's heart, Willa knew they would face them. They had carved this peace out of the rock. They had claimed it with blood and truth. And as the fire crackled and the vast, star-filled sky turned overhead, the wild land around them felt a little less cruel. It held them gently now, two scarred souls who had found the one thing harder than the mountain itself: love. Thank you for listening to this story of Elias and Willa. I hope their journey through the rugged West resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale, I encourage you to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories of the frontier. And please feel free to share your thoughts and feelings about the story in English. Your comments help keep these campfire tales alive.